Over the last 30 years, the most cherished video games of old have spiraled into long-lasting franchises, telling stories through sequels and prequels that expanded on the tales that captivated players in their original releases. Many of these series evolved into legends of their own, creating a timeline of lore that kept their avid communities entrenched in the game's world. Few sparked more interest, more mystery, and above all, the imagination of the gaming world than the Legend of Zelda. This tale began back in 1986 with the release of The Legend of Zelda for the NES. It went on to become a landmark for many reasons, but its plot wasn't among them. The only story elements came in the form of a brief text paragraph that explained you were on a quest to save Zelda from an evil being known as Ganon. If you managed to delve into the game's manual, you were treated to a bit more narrative, like why Ganon, wielding the Triforce of Power, invaded Hyrule, seeking the Triforce of Wisdom. When Zelda caught wind of the invasion, she dispatched her nursemaid Impa to find a hero valiant enough to save Hyrule, but not before breaking the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 fragments and hiding them. Link eventually claimed these fragments and saved the kingdom and its young princess. A little over a year later, Nintendo released a sequel, The Adventure of Link. From the game's introduction and manual, we learned that after Ganon was destroyed in the first game, Link set out to find the Triforce of Courage in order to awaken a slumbering Princess Zelda. Not the same princess from the original game, but an ancestor from an era long past. Meanwhile, Ganon's minions were out for Link's blood, which could be used to revive the Demon King. A few more narrative elements were sprinkled throughout the game, but much of the plot was again tucked away in the game's manual. The backstory here painted a broader picture of the Kingdom of Hyrule and its history, bringing to light a tale that transpired long before either of the two games. It felt like there was more to the chronology than a few lines of text. Nevertheless, Hyrule planted the indelible thought that there was more to it than initially met the eye, igniting the imaginations of countless travelers who would brave its monster-ridden plains. The next game in the series proved to be a catalyst. It broke the serialized nature of the franchise and was branded as a prequel. The new adventure put a heavier emphasis on the story, one which developed over the course of the game. Unlike its predecessors, players experienced the story simply by playing the game. A Link to the Past established much of the foundational lore the rest of the series would eventually draw upon, like the creation of Hyrule, the Triforce, the Master Sword, and the origins of Ganon. Given the information available, the chronology of lore in the Zelda universe appeared simple enough. However, Nintendo's decision to make a prequel, rather than continue in a serialized format, marked the start of a perplexing trend. Zelda took a departure from the norm in Link's Awakening. While it did little to expand upon the Hyrule lore, it was a touching side story that gave us a rare glimpse into Link's personality. The legendary hero had set off to hone his skills after defeating Ganon in A Link to the Past, but on his return voyage, a maelstrom destroyed his ship. Link washed ashore on the mysterious Koholint Island, where a young girl named Marin rescued the lad and nursed him back to health. The girl bore a striking resemblance to Zelda, one of the game's few connections to the rest of the series. Link learned that the only way to leave the island was to wake the Windfish, a protective deity slumbering inside a giant egg atop the island's tallest mountain. However, Link's freedom ultimately came at a high price. The entirety of Koholint was but a dream of the windfish, and awakening the creature would spell the end of the island and all its inhabitants. It was an emotional tale with a depressing conclusion that remains one of the most memorable in the series. Though Link's awakening was more of a side story, it potentially held an important clue for theorists to piecing the series together. The ship that Link was sailing on bore a striking resemblance to the ship introduced in later games, suggesting those games might share a connection. Distant association through shared imagery like this later formed a good number of the binding threads that eventually pieced the games together. It was 5 long years before we returned to Hyrule. In 1998's Ocarina of Time was presented as an origin story, chronicling the events that had been partially described in previous games. A young boy named Link set out with the means to stop the evil Ganondorf from claiming the Triforce with the aid of Princess Zelda, but their actions unintentionally triggered a sequence of events that ultimately led to the downfall of Hyrule. In the aftermath, Link gathered the courage to travel between 2 time periods in order to awaken 7 sages and obtain the strength to defeat Ganondorf once and for all. The hero of Time's adventure provided deeper insight into the series' mythos. 3 goddesses created Hyrule, and when they departed, they left behind the sacred Triforce, a relic that could grant one's wishes. In order to protect such a powerful item from falling into the wrong hands, it was hidden away in the sacred realm. Ganondorf, king of the Gerudo, lusted for this divine relic, and eventually learned of its resting place. For timeline theorists, the battle to stop Ganondorf from conquering Hyrule and ultimately seal him away in the sacred realm appeared to fall in line with what was outlined in A Link to the Past. In the months leading up to its release, Nintendo touted Ocarina of Time as a Genesis tale, and this was further supported by both the game's narrative and instruction manual. No one realized it then, but Ocarina of Time's ending later served as the basis for one of the biggest plot twists in the series. In the game's finale, Zelda decided to send the time-traveling hero back to his original time period. The implications of this action weren't fully realized until later on. That didn't stop some from speculating. Given the facts, it wasn't difficult for fans to piece together the timeline. The Legend of Zelda was followed by Zelda 2, a direct sequel. A Link to the Past was a prequel to the NES classics, which was then followed by Link's Awakening. In an interview conducted in Nintendo Power, series creator Shigeru Miyamoto revealed what he had deemed to be the official order of The Legend of Zelda. This remark flew in the face of what fans had speculated. For the first time, there was controversy amongst those who believed in an established timeline, and this one quote would spark a decades-long debate about the tales of Hyrule. The plot would soon thicken. Like its name implies, The Legend of Zelda could be just that, a legend, a series of self-contained stories that drew from the motifs established by its predecessors. Many other franchises ended up following this template to give greater storytelling freedom to its writers and producers. By the early 90s, Nintendo had successfully built a franchise around Link and Princess Zelda. With video games slowly becoming a mainstream medium of entertainment, some players began holding these serialized stories to the same standard as those told in books, TV shows, and even film sagas. And Zelda was not spared. In hindsight, the creators of Hyrule failed to anticipate this from some in their newfound fanbase. Some of the series' most avid fans built on the legend, dedicating themselves to piecing together what they perceived as threads that tied the story of every Zelda game together in an overarching chronology, a timeline. These fans were eventually branded as timeline theorists. 2 years later, Nintendo released a second Zelda game for the Nintendo 64, Majora's Mask. The opening sequence of the game revealed that several months after Ocarina of Time, Link was drawn into an alternate dimension called Termina, while searching for a friend. This strange world was being terrorized by the Skull Kid, a mischievous forest imp from Ocarina of Time who had stolen a mask, granting him incredible powers. Link only had 3 days to stop the real culprit, Majora's Mask itself, before it brought the moon crashing down into the surface. Like Link's Awakening, this direct sequel was more of a side story, but it served as an important clue for theorists who wanted to decipher a potential timeline. Majora's Mask took place after Link was returned to his original period by Zelda at the end of Ocarina of Time. This suggested to theorists that the events that led up to the point where Link was sent back in time were erased from history and were replaced by what transpired in Majora's Mask. A year after Majora's Mask, we were treated to not one, but 2 simultaneous Zelda releases, 2001's Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages for the Game Boy Color. Link was investigating the Triforce in Hyrule Castle one day when he was whisked away by the Divine Relic to the distant lands of Holodrum and Labrynna. Evil forces terrorized each land, and Link set out to restore order before they completely fell into chaos. Behind the scenes, Ganon's followers used the turmoil to their advantage and attempted to revive their fallen master. Many elements within the game's story pointed towards other games in the series, like the ship in the ending bearing an uncanny resemblance to the one in Link's Awakening, and timeline theorists sprang into action. Since the Triforce was unified and in Hyrule Castle, the only 2 places where Seasons and Ages seemed to make sense were either after the adventure of Link or A Link to the Past, the only other times where the Triforce was complete. Since the game's placement in the theorized timeline was far from conclusive, it strengthened the case against the existence of such a timeline. Many believed that Nintendo was just making up the chronology as it went along. Nintendo re-released A Link to the Past in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, which included a multiplayer game called Four Swords. This new version of the classic Super Nintendo game contained revised dialogue that amended terms like wise men with sages, a more direct reference to Ocarina of Time. Nintendo claimed it updated the terminology in this version so it had a stronger connection with previous games. Additionally, Four Swords turned out to be a whole new game with a self-contained story. Link was on a quest to stop an evil wind mage named Vati, who was freed from his prison and was bent on destroying Hyrule. The plot appeared very simple and ambiguous enough that it could take place almost at any time by those who intended to build a Zelda timeline. However, series producer Eiji Aonuma made a comment that Four Swords was the oldest story in the series, and it took place even before Ocarina of Time. Until that comment, timeline theorists usually place the game at the end of their chronology. Back in the 80s, it never occurred to some game developers that their games would spawn ongoing, narrative-driven franchises. Stories always took a back seat to the gameplay and mechanics that created some of the most classic gaming memories. While some franchises began following a single unified canon, Nintendo was uncompromising when designing for its flagship adventure game. For Shigeru Miyamoto and his team, the world you were playing in was far more important than the reason you were playing in it. Series canon was an afterthought to the game concepts that would power each new Zelda release. Following this philosophy, Link was redrawn for a new generation, bringing a tidal wave of new lore that forever altered the stories Zelda Timeline theorists had grown to love. 2003, Nintendo opened the floodgates and revealed The Wind Waker, and showed players a drastically re-envisioned Hyrule. Nintendo said that the game, which took place hundreds of years after the events of Ocarina of Time, told the tale of the downfall of the kingdom, and the return of Ganon after being sealed away at the end of Ocarina of Time. Rather than let its proud lands fall into the hands of evil, the gods of Hyrule instead decided to submerge it in a great flood. Several generations later, Ganon used the Triforce of Power, broke free from his prison below the waves, and sought the means to unify the Triforce and make his dark wishes come true. A new hero was born, and along with Zelda's descendant, rose to stop the evil menace. In the end, the Triforce washed away the remnants of Hyrule once and for all, and brought what appeared to be a conclusive end to the ancient kingdom. The finale was a confusing twist for timeline theorists. Ganon was defeated when Link thrust the Master Sword into his head, and the blade was washed away in the Dark Abyss along with the rest of Hyrule. With the kingdom submersed in water, it was tough to rationalize it as a setting for future games. How is the Master Sword found in the middle of the Lost Woods in A Link to the Past? Some theorists speculated that there would be a game in the future that would fill these perceived plot holes. Others had a more radical theory. What if there were two timelines as a result of the events in Ocarina of Time? These theorists surmised that at the end of Ocarina of Time, Zelda sent Link back in time to the day they met. This action effectively created a second timeline, which continued with Majora's Mask. However, the princess in the future who sent Link back in time persisted in her own timeline. According to these fans, what transpired in her reality led to the fall of Hyrule and Great Flood preceding the Wind Waker. So which of these timelines, if either, was established as Zelda canon? An interview with the minds behind The Legend of Zelda proved to be elusive. Eventually they were questioned on the series canon following The Wind Waker, in which they confirmed there were indeed two parallel timelines in the Zelda universe. However, most of the development team only spoke Japanese, so their remarks had to be translated into English. At the time, Nintendo of America had a shady track record with its localization, so some doubted the accuracy of their answers regarding these two timelines. 2004's Four Swords Adventures for the Gamecube was a continuation of the story in Four Swords. Vati broke free from his imprisonment within the Four Sword, and it was up to Link to defeat the Wind Mage once again. After finally confronting the villain, Ganon emerged from the shadows and revealed himself as the true culprit. Teaming up with Zelda, Link thwarted Ganon's scheme and restored peace. The numerous references to Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past made for yet another undecipherable puzzle for timeline theorists and made them question, once again, if an overarching timeline truly existed. Nintendo followed up Four Swords Adventures with a Minish Cap for the Game Boy Advance. The game was a prequel to Four Swords, revealing the origins of Vati. Given it was a prequel, it took place before the events of Four Swords. At this point though, given how little direct connection the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures had with the rest of the series, some timeline theorists discarded these three games from their Zelda canon altogether. The ongoing Legend of Zelda took a dark turn in the events of 2006's Twilight Princess. In the game's backstory, Ganon was banished to another dimension called the Twilight Realm, but generations later, he managed to break free. A new Link and Zelda joined forces with Midna, the deposed princess of the Twilight Realm, and the trio vanquished Ganon. Nintendo maintained that both The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were sequels to Ocarina of Time, which, given the drastically differing settings of both games, made a single timeline implausible for timeline theorists. Supporters of the split timeline were vindicated when Eiji Onuma came forth after the game's release and confirmed once and for all that there were two Zelda timelines. The history of Hyrule forked in two different directions at the end of Ocarina of Time. The Wind Waker took place after the future events in Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess transpired in a second timeline created when Link time-traveled and warned Zelda about Ganon, which averted the events of Ocarina of Time. The confirmation of a split timeline solved many of the problems that had stumped theorists, but the timeline placement of games like A Link to the Past and the original Legend of Zelda remained elusive. Nintendo brought the flooded Hyrule timeline back into focus with its next two releases. 2007's Phantom Hourglass was a direct sequel to The Wind Waker, where Link and Zelda were in the middle of their journey to find a new land when they came across a mysterious ghost ship. While exploring the ship, the duo was drawn into a mysterious world which was being threatened by an evil being called Bellum. Link ultimately rescued Zelda and saved the day. Eventually, they returned to their own ship and continued their quest to find a home, which was the setting of the next adventure. In 2009's Spirit Tracks, we learned that the crew finally found its way to a new land and christened it a New Hyrule. Several generations passed and a plot was hatched to free an ancient evil shackled by the magical spirit tracks that dotted the land. A new Link and Zelda rose up to take on this foe called Alidus, and they ultimately defeated the demon and returned peace to the New Hyrule. For the first time ever, Nintendo was continuing an arc through multiple direct games, and their placement was easy to discern. Those who followed the events of The Wind Waker were rewarded with an ongoing tale atypical for the series. But the trend was short-lived. In 2011, Nintendo released the latest entry in the series, Skyward Sword. For a long time, theorists speculated where the game took place in their timeline, and some hoped it would fill in some of its gaps. The game ended up taking place at the beginning of the timeline, and served as the foundation for many of the events that transpired in the other games. Skyward Sword was the origin story for the Master Sword. Link forged the blade over the course of the game, and it ended up containing the spirit of his companion Fi. Skyward Sword shone some light on key mysteries. For starters, it was revealed that the main antagonist, Demise, was the precursor to series villain Ganon. Demise promised his spirit would endure and that he'd be reincarnated. We also learned that there was a goddess named Hylia, who after a great war sacrificed her divine powers and became the mortal Zelda. This explained why the long line of those who bore the name Zelda had divine powers and guarded the Triforce. Skyward Sword marked the 25th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda. To some, the games were classic stories of a damsel in distress, but to Zelda Timeline theorists, it was a mythology that spanned thousands of years and alternate realities. For decades, rationalizing Zelda's continuity was a daunting task for those who took it upon themselves to find meaning in what many argued were just discrete games not meant to construct a single canonical timeline. Shigeru Miyamoto's philosophy of putting design and gameplay before story made these games classics, but to theorists, questions haunted their experience with each new release. Was there an official Zelda timeline? How could it possibly fit together? Would the franchise live up to its name and be just a series of legends loosely connected by an enduring mythos? Would Nintendo ever reveal the truth? Prior to the release of Skyward Sword, Nintendo went on record several times stating there was an official Zelda timeline. However, Nintendo refused to divulge its secrets and stated that leaving the chronology up to the imagination enriched the franchise. Then in December of 2011, Nintendo released Hyrule Historia, a collector's book containing what it declared was the official Zelda timeline. According to Nintendo, there weren't just two timelines, there were actually 3. The official timeline began with the events in Skyward Sword, the adventure where Link and Zelda defeated Demise and established the Kingdom of Hyrule. The game laid the foundation for several of the games that followed. After Skyward Sword, the events of the Minish Cap and Four Swords took place. These two games were ultimately little more than side stories, which was ironic, considering they posed a problem for those who tried to piece together the timeline in the past. The question that remained was how the Minish Cap and Four Swords served as sequels to Skyward Sword. If you recall, at the end of Skyward Sword, Link and Zelda decided to settle on the surface where they established the Kingdom of Hyrule. However, the kingdom founded at the end of Skyward Sword was under constant attack by monsters, and Nintendo decided that the backstory of the Minish Cap served as the basis for this time period. The Minish Cap and Four Swords also established two important elements, the forging of the Four Sword and the origin of the Wind Mage Vati, both of which reappeared later on in Four Swords adventures. The missing thread in the puzzle was the link between Four Swords and Ocarina of Time. Hyrule Historia expanded on the story of the fierce war mentioned in Ocarina of Time, explaining it as a civil war that ravaged the kingdom after the events of Four Swords. A king eventually came forth and reunified the nation, setting the stage for Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time was where things got interesting. Earlier we mentioned that according to Zelda theorists, the game served as the focal point for their split timeline theory, creating two parallel realities. The split was created when Zelda sent Link back in time. However, in Hyrule Historia, Nintendo revealed that Ocarina of Time was the basis for the creation of a new, third timeline. According to Nintendo, during the final battle with Ganon, Link was killed. With nobody to oppose him, Ganon went on to obtain the unified Triforce. This served as the perfect setup for the events known as the Seal War, described in the prologue of A Link to the Past, a war where the Knights of Hyrule fought Ganon and his forces, while the Seven Sages found a way to seal the evil king. For a long time, the question of whether or not the events in Ocarina of Time could be interpreted as the Seal War was a point of contention for theorists. Nintendo finally found a way to accommodate the event when it created this third, Fallen Hero timeline. The Fallen Hero timeline followed up Ocarina of Time with the events of A Link to the Past, the Oracle games, Link's Awakening, and finally the original two NES games. Theorists believe there was evidence to support this order, but definitively connecting the games wasn't possible without some new information provided by Nintendo. Given the imagery of the ship that Link sailed on in both Link's Awakening and the End of Oracles, some theorists had already surmised that these games were somehow connected. In the official timeline, Oracles of Ages and Seasons did indeed follow the events of A Link to the Past, as Link set sail for Hyrule. During his voyage home, he was shipwrecked, and the events of Link's Awakening followed. The last mystery that had puzzled theorists was how exactly any Zelda installment connected to the games that started it all, The Legend of Zelda and its sequel, The Adventure of Link. Nintendo provided a backstory in the manual of The Adventure of Link that outlined the events that transpired long before the NES games. However, this backstory was never intended to have any connection to the prequels that followed. Two major barriers always prevented theorists from conclusively determining their position in a Zelda timeline without additional lore. How was the unified Triforce split up in The Legend of Zelda? And how was Ganon able to return? Hyrule Historia didn't offer a proper answer to these questions, but the backstory of The Adventure of Link was reworked to serve as the connection between these two time periods. Sometime after A Link to the Past, the King of Hyrule was forced to split up the Triforce, leaving only the Triforce of Wisdom and Power with the royal family. The Triforce of Courage was hidden away within a distant palace. Ganon somehow managed to return and claim the Triforce of Power, and then began an invasion of Hyrule to capture the remaining pieces. This then led into Link's quest to reunite the Triforce of Wisdom and defeat Ganon in The Legend of Zelda. As for The Adventure of Link, it was always described as a direct sequel, so it made sense that it followed immediately after. That was the last game in this new timeline. For timeline theorists, the Fallen Hero timeline established a bewildering precedent for future installments. Within any existing game, Nintendo provided itself with a scapegoat since a timeline could be drawn where Link failed. It created almost unlimited possibilities for future Zelda games. The other two timelines were the direct result of Zelda's actions at the end of Ocarina of Time, something Nintendo had already confirmed in an interview conducted after the release of Twilight Princess. Though fans knew this for several years, what exactly transpired in either of these timelines wasn't clear. One of these timelines followed the exploits of Link as a child after he was sent back to the day when he first met Princess Zelda in Ocarina of Time. These were followed by Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures in a chronology commonly referred to as the Child Link timeline. The name isn't a reference to the appearance of Link, but rather that this continuity began after Link went back to his childhood in Ocarina of Time. What came next was no surprise, given that Majora's Mask was always labeled as a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time that involved the same incarnation of Link. The placement of Twilight Princess after Majora's Mask was also expected, given that Eiji Onuma's quote that stated Twilight Princess took place after Majora's Mask. Twilight Princess gave theorists a conclusive ending to this Child Link timeline as it culminated with the slaying of Ganon, but a missing piece still existed: Four Swords Adventures. Hyrule Historia told the story of how this game directly followed the events in Twilight Princess. Most puzzling was that Ganon appeared in both games, yet was slain at the end of Twilight Princess. According to Nintendo, the Ganon in Four Swords Adventures was an entirely new entity. Being a new character, this Ganon had no recollection of his predecessor's ambitions, aside from his lust for power. He manipulated Link and Zelda into freeing Vati from his imprisonment within the Four Sword. With the heroes occupied trying to contain the Wind Mage, Ganon rose to power, but in the end, Link and Zelda ultimately sealed him within the Four Sword. The final timeline left to tackle followed Zelda's thread of the story after she sent Link back in time to warn her former self about Ganon's scheme to overthrow the kingdom. The events that followed were told in The Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and finally Spirit Tracks. This branch of the trio of timelines was referred to as the Adult Link timeline because these games continued on after the exploits of Adult Link and Ocarina of Time. It was also the easiest to decipher for those who followed the stories. Zelda was left alone to oversee the restoration of her kingdom in the aftermath of Ganon's reign. Many years passed, and the menace, who had been sealed away by Zelda and the sages, managed to break free using the Triforce of Power. He threatened the kingdom once again, while the people of Hyrule believed the Hero of Time would return to save them. But the hero never came. These are the exact events described in the prologue of The Wind Waker, which culminated with the gods sealing Hyrule and Ganon below the sea in a great flood. Link's adventures across this great sea followed, and from there the subsequent games made perfect sense. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks were all part of a single narrative thread that began in The Wind Waker. These direct sequels chronicled the quest of Link and Zelda as they set out to find a new home. Hyrule was destroyed at the end of The Wind Waker, and the duo set out and established a new kingdom. Phantom Hourglass was a minor detour in their journey, while Spirit Tracks was set in the land Link and Zelda eventually colonized. This new Hyrule wasn't likely to see the return of Ganon, the Triforce, or the Master Sword. This faraway land provided a fresh new start for the lore of the series, where Hyrule Historia stated that the bloodlines of those tied to the ancient kingdom were growing thin, so going forward, a new history would be spun. Three distinct timelines. Skyward Sword, the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and then Ocarina of Time served as the point where the timelines diverged. The Fallen Hero timeline consisted of A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, Link's Awakening, The Legend of Zelda, and finally, The Adventure of Link. The Child Link timeline was comprised of Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures. And finally, the Adult Link timeline contained The Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. The official Zelda timeline was 25 years in the making. Sorting it out was a tall order, but just imagine how difficult it was to decipher the truth, relying solely on the games, manuals, and occasional cryptic interview. Decades of fan speculation on how the games fit together in a timeline concluded as the series creators filled in the blanks with brand new lore. This backstory in Hyrule Historia provided the final pieces of the puzzle for enthusiasts. Since 1986, The Legend of Zelda's timeline wove an intricate series of threads that created its own subculture of fans, unlike any other franchise in gaming history. It could be argued that its final canon was pieced together by both its creators and fans alike.